Thanks so much, Kurt. That was so many things are happening for me in reflection as you were speaking, and a few folks have dropped some questions into the chat box. So we are compiling those. I've got a few myself, but if you have questions, drop them in the chat, and we'll put them in the queue, and I'll raise those to Kurt here in just a minute. We're going to ask everybody to keep yourselves muted, just so that we can cut down on background noise and things like that. But Kurt, let me start with, I think I saw this come up a couple times in the chat in relation to some of your comments. You mentioned that God didn't create us virtually, not from a distance. We're embodied, we're relational, we're close, there's proximity, there's intimacy. But I think, the elephant in the room is global quarantine, right? We are socially distanced. We couldn't gather together. And I think you kind of probably alluded to that, but maybe we can appropriate some of the implications of our cultural context is so not ideal, and that's got to have massive negative implications. Maybe you can kind of help us navigate that a bit in light of what you said.
Yeah, sure. I think one thing I would do, Matt, is just to, I'd point people, I've written about a half dozen essays that are on my website around the pandemic, including one that speaks more explicitly to this notion of embodiment that people can read, including some really, hopefully some concrete applications and steps of like, what do we do about these things? The first thing I would say is that that we are finding this to be difficult is not because we're stupid or weak. We are finding this to be difficult at many levels because we were not made to live like this. There is no question about that. That this has been going on for as long as it has is painful in many, many different respects. And so one of the things that's really important for us to be doing with each other, even if we're doing it on Zoom, is to be acknowledging in embodied ways to the degree that we can, to acknowledging with each other that this is really hard. And the fact that it continues to be hard, we are folks who are kind of primed to, if I complain to you about something that's an ongoing problem, it's like, I get to complain to you like maybe once, maybe twice. But once I've complained twice, I got to keep my yap shut. This is something for which it's really important for us to be able to continue to talk about this, to continue to be present with each other. Again, on my website, there are some other things that I talked about like the importance of doing things that actively have our bodies engaged in things, whether that's taking a walk 3 times a day for 5 minutes, whether that is engaging in creative activity, whether that is making a practice of whether you're living in an apartment, whether you're living in a small neighborhood, whether you're living someplace that you knock on somebody's door and they come to the door and you say, I just want to take 3 or 4 minutes of your time and just say, I'm just wondering how you're doing. And I really want to find out from you, how you are, because I want to tell you how I am. Even those kinds of interactions are helpful and important. But I also want to say this. In many respects, I've said, the pandemic is not just something that has caused distress. It has revealed ourselves to ourselves. We are not in distress just because of the pandemic. The pandemic has pulled the curtain back on behaviors that we have been engaging in for some time now that have in many respects left us culturally and interpersonally and individually fragile. We are not people who have who have a lot of practice sharing our stories in deeply embodied ways with one another. We're not people who are necessarily, if you were to look at cross-section, are not necessarily immersed in the texts of scriptures. We're not necessarily immersed in a practice of confessional community with others who know us and whom we know, who, when this happens and the Zoom calls have to come, I can connect with you because I've been spending time with you anyway, and I know that I'm known by you. But what this then means is that I will have to go the extra distance, even when I'm in a virtual world. I will have to go the extra distance to be even more creative about the questions that I ask, the conversations that I have. For example, it's easy for us to say, so how are you doing? And Like everybody asks that question 100 times a day, it's become fairly meaningless. That's a different question than this. Could you tell me one thing that has made you really angry today? Could you tell me one thing that you feel today, like you're acutely today, like you're really sensing its loss? But also, could you tell me one thing today that you're really grateful for? Could you tell me one thing that's brought you joy? Could you tell me one thing where you've recognized beauty in the world? I want to hear about it. I want you to hear me. I want you to tell me about this. These are not conversations that we have normally. We don't say these things to each other. The fact that we don't is a testimony to our fragile and thinned out spiritual selves. And in fact, the pandemic now gives us an opportunity to begin to develop spiritual disciplines that heretofore we weren't. And the story of the biblical narrative that to me has made the most difference is the story of the Jewish exile to Babylon. The Jews had a sense of the way the world was supposed to be. And suddenly it's all upended. It's as if the pandemic has become our own personal Babylonian horde, and it has taken us off into exile. And, you know, there were many Jews who thought, hey, this is only going to last 6 weeks. There were plenty of prophets who were telling them this. There were prophets who were telling them, look, Nebuchadnezzar is going to get you like a third of the way out in the desert. He's going to get tired of like dragging you out there, and he's going to like just let you go. No. Jeremiah was saying, dig in, build houses, get married, have kids, your kids have babies, plant gardens, and pray for the prosperity of the city. This sense that this now becomes an opportunity for us, yes, to name our griefs, to lament our losses, but losses that we've had long before the pandemic, in order for us then to dig further in to see what God is going to do with this situation and watch beauty emerge in ways that we heretofore couldn't have imagined.
Yeah, I found myself just saying to our team, our leadership, folks in our church, that the pandemic, like, we don't want to just slap a Band-Aid on it and try to make it through. We don't want to waste the crisis.
Right.
We want to grow and find out how it can help us be more well-formed. There's one question that came up in the chat from Vicky that I thought was really interesting, really good question. And I'm going to kind of read it and paraphrase it a little bit at the same time. So she says, I'm very aware of a disappointment. I think the experience of disappointment in church, where it's mostly information about God or Jesus that's kind of cognitive, happening from brains. And she says she longs for church services where there's a more of an experience of God, see, feel, hear him in an embodied way in her body. What's happening from a neurobiology point of view with that? It feels like being with other brains is not enough. I want to experience love, grace, and hope. I think the question is getting at, and I think there's some things going on here, but so much of North American, especially maybe other parts of the world, but Protestant Christianity is very cognitive. Mm-hmm. And maybe we have resisted some of the affective aspects of Christian worship that appear in other traditions. Mm-hmm. And I think that question is getting at that desire for a more affective experience of worship, and not to denigrate the cognitive aspect, that's important, but a lot of our folks who are here are in church leadership, and I wonder maybe if you could speak to us a little bit about that relationship and maybe offer us some guidance as we think about our worship.
Right. Well, I'll say this much. I actually have a third book that's coming in September, and the title of it is The Soul of Desire, the Neuroscience of Longing, Beauty, and Community. And it's really, I mean, what the question that you're asking is not the only thing that's going to try to get at, but it will address this in no small way. And I'll respond by saying this, that, you know, we like to say that the brain, and this is an oversimplified way of talking about it, but one way that we talk about it is that the brain operates bottom to top and left and right to left, meaning that we sense things. We have 8 different senses. We sense things, and that sense runs to, and I perceive those senses, right? I sense things, but then I have to make perceptions. I have to make a sense like, what is that? And those perceptions are happening very, very quickly. That's all included with my bodily feelings. along with my memory and my story, my family history, and so forth and so on. And that all largely runs mostly to the right hemisphere. And from there, the right hemisphere sends this information to the left hemisphere, where we then say, I like to say that we first we sense, and then we make sense of what we sense. And the left brain then is doing this thoughtful recognition, almost at a distance, as a way of then helping to make sense and giving that information back to the right hemisphere so that we can then even shape what I'm sensing. And as Ian McGilchrist in The Master and His Emissary so poignantly points out, the way human development emerges is such that it would appear that the role of the left hemisphere ideally is to serve at the behest of the right. The role of the left hemisphere is absolutely crucial. I need to be able to cognitively understand things. If I can't cognitively understand things, I can't change my flat tire. I can't do math problems. I can't learn how to fly a plane. I need to be able to cognitively keep things in mind. I need to be able to kind of contain and hold my right hemisphere in a container. I need to be able to do that. But in the West, historically, we have moved from this kind of balance of my right hemisphere creating, sensing, feeling, imaging, and then having the left hemisphere be its emissary, as you will, help shape it, to a world that is now dominated by a way in which the left hemisphere views the world, a more analytic, a more cognitive, a more distanced posture toward the world. The church has been no less a product of this. And so in Protestantism in particular, we do pay a lot of homage to the way the left hemisphere functions. And it's important to know that, again, we need the left hemisphere as much as anything. The challenge for us, as you rightly say, is that I want to have more than just some kind of abstract set of principles. I want to sense it and feel it in my body. Well, the Pentecostals can teach us some things about this, right? It's not as if like North American, Protestant churches don't have any sense of feeling. Like we've got plenty of, we've got charismatic Catholic churches. We've got, Eastern Orthodox churches. We've got churches that pay attention to the activity of the right hemisphere. And all of that is important, but it's equally important for another reason, that I be able to activate my right hemisphere. And we're going to get to this in the third talk today. And that is this. I really deeply want to have a felt sense of God's presence, a felt sense of God speaking to me in the course of my worship, in the course of my time with my church. But I'm not so sure that I want God to come mucking around in my shame. I'm not so sure I want God coming around and putting his finger on the things that I need to restrain. I'm not so sure that I want people having access to the parts of me that I've been working really hard to hide for the most of my life. But this also involves right hemisphere engagement. We're going to talk about in our third session about the role of community, not just in bringing celebration, not just bringing joy, not just bringing worship, but also the community bringing mercy into the very places where I have housed my shame and have created coping strategies, either of keeping my distance from God or engaging in behaviors of addiction. And by addiction, I don't mean just cocaine and marijuana and alcohol. I mean pornography, I mean food, I mean work. I mean, as Gerald May would say, like, we're all addicts. It's just a matter of like, what's my addiction of choice? And I have all kinds of ways that I'm coping with those parts of me that, like the first woman and man, are vulnerable, but where shame has it locked up. So in the same way that we want God to come and meet us in worship in our right hemispheres, and it would be helpful for us, right? And this is where artwork, this is where all kinds of other ways in which we can shape and make worship so much more robust to kind of access those parts of us that are not just strictly cognitive. And at the same time, how can we create communities that can access my right brain for the purpose of healing and recommissioning so that we can practice for the heaven that's coming?
That's really helpful. And I think it gets at the next question, which I think you sort of got at this, but I want to ask it, and maybe it may create a little more clarity. Tammy says, can you say a little bit more about the cost of resisting vulnerability? I think you said vulnerability creates space for us to be open to God. And I think, like, along with that, does our, like, when we slide ourselves into sort of purely cognitive uh, relate ways of knowing God, or is that a defensive mechanism perhaps to avoid vulnerability? And then what's the cost that's involved with that?
Right. Well, one thing I'd like to say is that we don't engage anything in the world purely cognitively. We didn't talk much about the phenomenon of emotion, but this would maybe be a place to talk about that a little bit. I like to talk about emotion as the fuel in the tank, right? It's like the gas in the car's gas tank. We don't build cars just to have a place to put gasoline, or just to have a place to put a battery that's electrically charged. We don't build them for that reason. But there's nothing that you do with an automobile that is not a function of fuel regulation. You turn it on, you back it up, you go forward, you turn it, you speed up, you slow down, you do whatever it is, you're just idling. Like, fuel regulation is constantly going on in the function of an automobile. And in the same way, emotion is constantly in play with all of our lives all of the time. Heck, when you're asleep, you have dreams and you feel things. So emotion is there all the time, always shaping what we call cognition. So we might say that if I am actively practicing, we also didn't get a chance to talk much about neuroplasticity, but which we will in the third section. We are actively practicing forming my mind's neural networks to go down a certain path. If my cognitive way of being in the world is the thing that I practice, it does mean that I actively ignore or defend against emotional states, especially that I consider or feel to be afflicting, that I feel to be uncomfortable. And as we see from attachment research, the way I most effectively learn how to regulate afflicting emotion is by borrowing somebody else's brain. When I'm upset, the most effective way for me to regulate my distress is not, as it turns out, just to white knuckle it and turn off my emotion. That's not the most effective way. Now, I can shut my emotion down, but I'm going to pay a different kind of price. The most effective way is what happens when someone sees me and says, Curt, are you okay? What's going on? And if I am able to actually reflect to them, I just got some bad news. Like, my third brother also now has cancer. My ability to see them seeing me actually changes the very nature of the state of my emotion. My not being alone with my emotion of sadness and grief and anger actually shapes and changes the experience of it when someone's empathic response to me meets my mind. This is why compassion isn't just some kind of spiritual phenomenon in the abstract. It is a thing that we experience bodily. And if I'm not having that kind of embodied experience of compassion about the parts of my story where the emotional payload related to it is afflicting, I'm going to burn a ton of energy having to contain that. And that will be energy that will not be available to me to love my enemies as I love myself. It will not be available to me to create beauty and goodness, especially in the places where I might be more afraid to go and do so.
Continuing with the theme of vulnerability, Janet Dean, and we'll give a shout out to Asbury University. Janet's on the faculty there, is a great colleague. She asked, how do we heal and recover when we have allowed other Christians into those vulnerable places, but they brought judgment and pain rather than mercy and grace? So we're afraid of vulnerability for that very reason, right?
Janet, if I had the answer to that question, unfortunately, I'd be out of a job, right? No. I'd have to first make a lot of money on the front end, and then I'd be out of a job. So I am struck. I'm struck by some storylines about this, and that is that I mean, I don't know why, and especially in Near Eastern culture, we Westerners would have, we would have more trouble with this because we want everything to be so egalitarian, and we don't understand why it is that there were only 3 dudes who got to go with Jesus up onto the Mount of Transfiguration. Why are there, and why was there one who got to be, like the one whom Jesus loved? Like we'd all kind of have, trouble with that. Why do I bring that up? This sense, though, that Jesus did demonstrate that there were certain people that had his heart in ways that other people didn't. Certain people had access to him in ways that other people didn't. Now, that's not to suggest that they didn't have as robust an experience for who they were. I'm simply saying that the notion of, and we'll talk about this in our next time, the notion of trauma where it is most painful always takes place in the context of those relationships with whom we have the greatest intimacy. Mm. And unfortunately for us as believers, it often takes place in the context of the church. And this is why, in many respects, we have people that are leaving the church because of the things that have happened there. And I want to suggest that as much as that is the case, when we ask, like, well, how, what are we to do when our vulnerability that we've longed to share has now been kind of trampled? It feels like we've cast our pearls before swine, and it's just been trampled. And I would say, first of all, it's going to be important for us to be in contact with people who can help us grieve that. That's really important. And you're like, well, who are those people going to be? Because they would be the people I'd have to tell. And if I told them, then I might just have like a repeat offender. And I would say it's tricky. There's no easy answer for this, but I do know this. I know that Jesus knows what it's like to ask people to come and follow him, and they won't. I know what it's like. I know that Jesus knows what it's like to have people betray him. Yeah. I know that Jesus knows exactly what it's like for us to have to live in a world that he has made, in which vulnerability is a necessity for growth and the creation of beauty, and at the same time that is at risk. And I hear him saying, this, so it makes me want to say words that my mother would not be happy for me to say. This is really hard. Let's keep trying. This is really hard. I'm not going to leave you alone. So what I want you to do is I want you to find one. And then when you and the one find each other, I want you to find another one. Get 3 together. For the last 26 years, I've been meeting with 2 other guys every Tuesday morning. And it's a time for confession and prayer. And like, the thing is that like, it's really great. And it has also had its own moments where we get upset with each other about things that happen. Like, how can you not like have things happen that you're pissed off about with them? You're not just there to talk about other people. And so we have our own ruptures that we have to repair. I've been part of a covenant group of 4 families that have been together for that same amount of time, almost 30 years actually. And we've had a lot of rupture repair in the course of our time together, which is what has brought us together. And so Janet, I want to acknowledge that this is really, really hard. And I also want to acknowledge that I don't believe that there's another way to get through it. Like, I do believe that like we are vulnerable. To flourish, vulnerability is required. It is risky business. And I would say that, I'm just thinking, now, of course, this is me. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a biblical scholar, so I can get away with saying this. Because then I can say, well, I'm not a biblical scholar, so like, what do I know? But can you imagine, like, it's in Genesis 1, and the Holy Trinity is like making all that they're making. And you get to that part where, it's like, and God said, let there be this, and there was this, and you'd think if it was consistent, we'd get to day 6, and God would just say, and let there be humankind, and there was humankind. But they had a conversation about it. And God said, let us. They're like, we're gonna talk about this. Let us make mankind in our image. He doesn't, there's no sense of them having a conversation about making the stars. We're gonna have a conversation. Let us do this. And like, I can imagine Jesus saying like, I'm not so sure this is a great idea. Because like, I can see like, I see where this is going. I'm making, there's nothing to make light of, but there's this sense in which, unless we believe that Jesus' pain wasn't real, then we have to know that from the very beginning,
God knew what this is going to cost him. And we may grieve differently than Jesus grieved over Jerusalem. That would have been a holier grief than I will ever comprehend. But I just want us to know that Jesus is not unaware of how hard this is, because we're pushing against evil that is the weight of the earth. Evil has no intention of going quietly into the night. And any act toward vulnerability that you commit, any act toward creating goodness and beauty in the places where trauma exists, is a declaration of war against the kingdom of darkness. And it will come for us. And so this is where Jesus says, like, we pray. And we pray in community, because apart from it, we don't survive.
I find myself in pastoral contexts often where people will ask, like, why would God make the world knowing all this pain was coming? And I think your point of sort of shifting that, it's a similar strategy that I take. And it's not just a strategy. I think it's a crucial element, that God is not distant from that pain.
Right.
And then I always raise the question, I always make the point, I don't know why God decided to do it.
Right.
But apparently he thought whatever it cost him was worth the joy set before us was worth.
Right.
Not just
Right.
for us, but for him as well.
Right. Right.
And so
just
that's
just a real quick word about this. Like, it's interesting. I would just say this about the question why. Right. We have 5 interrogatory questions in the English language: who, what, where, when, how. And then we've got this question why. And we often use the question why interchangeably with how, like, why does the engine work like that? But frequently we utter the question why would God this? Why would God that? You know, if you have, why did my son not come home from Iraq? Like, no answer is going to satisfy that question. Why is the question we utter when we are often too overwhelmed to name our grief, to name our distress, to name our sorrow, because I feel so alone with what it is that I'm experiencing. And so one of the things that the why question can do is can get us into a context in which we can be connected with others who can say, let's pause on the why question and tell me what you're feeling.
Yeah.
And the moment that you tell me what you're feeling, you can experience connection that changes your need to ask the question why in the first place.
That's helpful. So in light of that, one attendee, Joe, asks, what does it mean to flourish then? If we're talking about all the pain and all the struggle, and we want to move in a direction of flourishing, you may want to just sort of kick this later into the day, but maybe you can give us a hint.
Yeah, well, I go back to this notion of that, it's interesting in medical school and in psychiatry, for me at least, and many others. My friend Dan Siegel has done all these polls in which he would say only about 2% of people would ever admit this. I never had a single lecture on what mental health actually is. You can tell me when mental pathology is in the room, right? When things are broken, when things are messed up, when there's a problem, I can identify that. We can pathologize things. It's easy for us to do that. But it's not always easy for us to identify, well, what does it look like if we're flourishing? If we're like, what are the signs of that? And this is where interpersonal neurobiology actually can be really helpful with this, when it talks about this notion of integration. And again, I go back to this idea of the orchestra, this idea that we have not just that me personally, I sense and image and feel and think and do with my body, those 5 different things that we do, just like the different parts of the orchestra. I need to be able to cultivate and grow all of those. But in the same way, we also have different parts of a body, of a community, that also by extension need to be cultivated. And then those different differentiated parts need to be linked together. The conductor brings those different, the woodwinds and the strings and the brass and the percussion together in this integrated whole. And that doesn't mean that we never make mistakes. If you were to go backstage after Beethoven's Ninth is done, and you were to like talk to all the performers, you would find that like there would be plenty of people who say that I missed that note, I missed that, I missed that, I missed that. But you don't, it's not like it devastates everything. I mean, think about this. Like last night, we had some technical trouble. And the technical trouble becomes like a rupture. It becomes a rupture and becomes like this opportunity, like it's an opportunity for, you know, we get impatient, we get all the things that we all know that we all feel. And at the same time, it becomes this opportunity for great creativity. It becomes this opportunity for people to come together in ways that they weren't going to have to before. It becomes an opportunity for us to do things in a way that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. And so to flourish does not mean that we never make mistakes. It doesn't mean we don't get hurt. It does mean that we repair ruptures. It does mean that in this, as Dan would like to say, Dan Siegel, this river of integration that has this wide river that has a bank of what we would call chaos on the one side, where my life is chaotic. And on the other side, the bank is just rigid. So I would like to say, look, if you went to the symphony to hear Beethoven's Ninth, and all the instruments were just playing whatever they wanted, like you wouldn't want to pay for that. At the same time, that's like chaotic. And many of us have lived in chaotic homes. Many of us feel like our minds are chaotic. We're all over the place. We can't control our emotion. My thoughts come out of my mouth faster than I can get them to stop. On the other side is the bank of rigidity. If you went to hear Beethoven's Ninth and every instrument only played the same note all the time, you wouldn't want to pay for that either. Mm-hmm. And we have places in our lives where we also become rigid, right? My emotion is too chaotic, and so I'm going to clamp down on it, and I'm not going to talk about it at all. Or, you know, it's going to be like growing up in my house, tell people, I think this might have been an Ohio thing, but I'm not so sure. Where my father would say, you stop your crying, or I'm going to give you something to cry about.
Wow.
It's kind of like a singular disciplinary tactic. It's just kind of like one size fits all kind of disciplinary tactic. And this notion that like, okay, like there is a certain narrow, rigid way in which one has to operate in this house, which means I grew up in a family learning that anger was dangerous. And so like I'm still like, if people get mad at me, like it's not very fun for me, because it feels threatening, because like I've got images of like being like 6 or 10 and like having a guy who's 6'1" and 210 pounds, who's like not a mean guy, not an angry guy. Well, that's because we're worked pretty hard not to piss him off. And so we can find ourselves being fairly rigid about certain things and not allowing certain parts of the orchestra to play because you're not allowed in here, because you're too dangerous. To flourish means we have to do the work of telling our stories as truly as possible, identifying all the emotional context that is associated with that, in light of this grander story in which we are following hard after Jesus, in which we are living in this covering of a text and of a biblical story, this historical event of Jesus' life that is shaping all of this storytelling that I'm doing, in which we can bring all of who we are to the table and allow God to form and shape that. If I don't bring my anger, if I don't bring my shame, if I don't bring my longings, my hopes, my joy, that will be a part of my story that we are not allowing God to have access to, that he can then take and shape and mold and help be part of his ever-growing beatific vision for the world as we practice for heaven.
That's helpful. I think since you called us out on the rupture that was last night, I'll say this. My son, my 11-year-old son, was in the room, kind of running errands and grabbing things for us and helping out. And I found myself thinking, like, not only is my team watching how I handle this disaster, but so is my son.
Right on.
You know, and what am I embodying in this moment in front of him? So that's a really crucial point. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll take a 5-minute break.
Yeah. I just want to say this one last thing, and we'll talk about. I just want to say this.
Yeah.
Like so that thing that you just named,
Mm-hmm.
the thing you just named. Our life is mostly, by far, made up of those kinds of moments.
Mm.
It's not made up. Most of life is not made up of like some big thing that happens. By far, most of life is made up of these small moments. And the fact that you're paying attention to the mind of your son, that then means it shapes how you are responding, because you're aware that he's watching and you are allowing him to give, I mean, you're allowing yourself to have the experience of being known by him, even in the way that you're responding to this, traumatic event such as it was last night. And he's 11, right? So he's going to be aware enough that like my dad's like he's in charge and things are not going well.
Yeah.
And so I just want to say our lives are made up of dozens of those moments every day. And I'm just, it's really touching that you're being mindful of that. And that's the work that we are called to do. What's hard is that if I myself am not being seen by others on a regular basis, it will be harder for me to be aware of seeing others in the way that you saw your son.
Mm. And as I think about that, if we can, maybe we can have our just difficulty last night as some positive opportunity for some helpful reflection. I'm thinking about this from the Wesleyan tradition, thinking about holiness and sanctification and how, in those moments when things are just crumbling and others are watching, thinking about this in relation to my son, Patrick, his life is a series of those small moments.
Right.
And the way that he will raise my grandchildren will be impacted by how he sees me handle myself when things are falling apart.
Yep.
If he sees me lose it and shout and swear, then, that's a model that he'll embody.
Right.
But if there's a kind of a appropriate handling there, and maybe we can all remember that in relationships, that we are embedded in these relationships, aren't we?
We are.
And it's not just my holiness that's at stake, it's yours.
Right, exactly. It's, I mean, and we could go on and on about the quantum mechanics that are involved in all this and so forth and so on. I just want to put a plug in for the notion of attachment here. Many people would ask me, well, Curt, how do we make sure that we raise our kids right? How do we raise our kids to have secure attachment? What are the parenting tips? What are the things we can do? And I said, look, there are lots of different things that go into forming secure attachment, which in many respects is what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about your son developing secure attachment, because the degree to which he does is likely that the way he will raise your grandchildren will be in such a way that will create secure attachment in them, which includes all the things that we're talking about. But the single most powerful thing that any one person can do to create the space for secure attachment to develop in their children is to make sense of your own personal life story. As much as we want parenting courses, as much as we want all this other stuff, all of which is good, helpful, the single most important variable is, what am I, Curt, what am I doing to make sense of my life? Because if I'm not doing that, it's going to be really easy for me to become the very thing that I don't want my kid to see, or to treat my kid in a way that I don't want to treat my kid, because I'm not taking care of my own story. And the good news about this is that is work that we can do, but I need outside help.
Yeah. And if I can just plug your book, there's a big section in Anatomy of the Soul on your life story and kind of beginning to write that, articulate that, and those kinds of things. I do want to ask, and thank you so much. That's really helpful. It's very personal, but I appreciate the chance for us to kind of hash that out, and I hope it was helpful. This is a slightly different direction, but I think it's really important because you mentioned that just the centrality of differentiation in the creation narratives. Mm-hmm. And you related that to ethnicities. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but think of the last 10, 15 years of escalating racial and ethnic tension, to say the least.
Right.
At least in North America and perhaps other places in the world. I mean, if Christians are the people with a differentiated one God in the Trinity, and if, as Ephesians 2 says explicitly, that Jesus died to break down the wall of hostility between ethnic groups, how, I mean, and the church is not always on the front lines of that conflict in a healing way.
Mhm.
How do we get there? I mean, shouldn't we be there, and how do we get there?
Wow, should we have another conference next weekend?
Maybe we'll do a conference on how Jesus heals racism.
Just
that?
just about this. Well, so yeah, you know, how do you answer this in 30 seconds? I'll say this. I'll just as a little personal vignette. So I grew up in this town of about 800 people in Eastern Ohio, and I grew up in an evangelical Quaker community. And in our town,
in our town, we had about a half dozen places in town and in surrounding farmhouses outside of town that were stops on the Underground Railroad. And I grew up hearing a pastor who had just spent 17 years in India talk about these things. And all I can say is that I was shaped to pay attention to these things while at the same time living in a town where our African American community like lived in their own space. And it taught me early and often about the role and the place of what it meant to be white. And that, you know, I would say that, yes, in the church, and some of my African-American friends, when I talk with them, we agree that like we who are in the white community have a lot of work to do ourselves. Long before we are going to be like making connections with our Black brothers and sisters. We have lamenting to do about our own culpability, about our own challenges, and not in a way that like, you know, grovels. God's not looking for groveling. God's not looking for us to spend, you know, a month of Sundays just feeling bad about feeling bad. God is looking for us to own what belongs to us and then move to use the real agency and power that we have as white Christians to create space for justice and mercy in the world wherever we see that it is needed. And, you know, I mean, I'm a middle-aged white dude, and I'm like, relatively speaking, like I've got more power than anybody in our country, relatively speaking. And my thing is that my role is to like, well, if I've got this kind of power, what am I doing with it? What am I doing to create mercy and justice for those who have less power than I do? And I think that it's important for us to remember that, you know, the New Testament was written to a people group that were, you know, under the thumb of the emperor. You know, it wasn't, you know, it was written primarily to people who knew what it meant to be enslaved. I mean, there were you know, Christians who were slaves, and so I am just aware of how much work there is to do, but I'm also hopeful. I'm hopeful in the sense that like, okay, we can look and see just how big the burden is, and I could then get overwhelmed by that and say, well, you know, gosh, I'm just overwhelmed, but instead, I want to say, what can I do today? And I'm going to do that today. What am I doing to have a gathering of conversations with my white sisters and brothers about what we can do to clear out our own house, clean that up, in order for us then to build personal relationships with people of color, in order for us to be able to be supportive in
the ways that they would like for us to be supportive. And I'll need to hear more of that from them, but probably after I get my own house a little more, more tidied up.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's very helpful. It's definitely a topic that we need to be thinking about. And I've thought, those of us, who have a platform and power and privilege in those ways, and education and the things that sort of create space for conversation like we're having, the question then becomes, are we using those things in healing ways? So I think that's important. Maybe that is one of our next endeavors that needs to be. We'll think about that. Friends, we're going to take about 5 minutes and we'll come back together. It's 10:33 Central Time. So at 10:40, we will resume. I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about our grant and the sermon series that is starting tomorrow as a part of that. And then we will launch into Curt's second lecture, The Science of Brokenness. So take 5-6 minutes and we'll be back in just that time. Thank you.